I'm Nikki Jovicic from LookUpStrata, and for today's webinar session, I'm joined by Berney and Dakota Panetta from Solutions and Engineering. In this webinar, we're talking about 10-year maintenance plans or sinking funds, depending on which state you're in. Peter and Dakota have a presentation on this topic. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that the information contained in this session, including the discussions that arise from submitted questions, is not legal advice and should not be relied upon as legal advice. You should seek independent advice before acting on the information contained in this session. Very shortly, we'll be joined by Berney and Dakota Panetta from Solutions and Engineering. Peter is the National Business Development Manager for the Solutions Group of companies, including Solutions and Engineering, Solutions in Fire, and ARM Contractor Compliance. Peter has over 15 years experience in the industry and has conducted hundreds of seminars within the strata and real estate industry around the country and in North America. He served on the board of the SCA Victoria and continues to serve on various national, New South Wales, Queensland and strata committees. Dakota has spent 6 years in the property and strata industry, including managing a portfolio of luxury properties on the Sunshine Coast for a number of years. More recently, he's travelled around Australia and New Zealand, delivering compliance updates and training sessions to strata managers and strata owners alike. Dakota has also assisted the national chapter of SCA to deliver training courses to new strata managers throughout Australia, as well as the New Zealand chapter. Dakota is a business development manager in a national role with Solutions and Engineering. Both Peter and Dakota are also regular contributors to the LookUpStrata site, providing articles plus answering strata Q&As we receive from our audience. Their responses regularly appear in our twice-weekly newsletters and monthly or bi-monthly magazines. Just one of our articles from the SIE team, dealing with safety and maintenance of older buildings, has had almost 10,000 page views. This is not Peter's first appearance on a LookUpStrata video. I interviewed Peter about changes to the New South Wales window lock legislation way back in 2016. Welcome, Peter and Dakota, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Nikki.
Thanks, Nikki. Thanks for having us as well today.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So, guys, we'll jump into it. And again, thank you, as Nikki said, to everyone that's got up either early or even our New Zealand visitors. You're probably having lunch about now as well. So whatever time zone you're in, welcome. And thank you for dedicating your time to watch us and listen to us present today. And hopefully, Pete and I hope you'll certainly learn something out of this. And hopefully we cover a bit of everything, regardless of where you're located today. So what I might do, I'll jump straight in and share our PowerPoint we've organised. Okay, let's throw that straight into presentation mode. Awesome. Nikki, I'll just double check. You can see that one and we're all good.
I can, that looks fantastic. Thank you.
Lovely.
Great, thank you.
Well, again, welcome, guys, and thank you to everyone that's joined us today. As Nikki said, Pete and I do operate in national roles, so we deal with a lot of different legislation, a lot of different regions, and quite often the moment you take a phone call, you start talking to someone, you've got to work out which hat you're putting on today, depending on the region you operate in. But this particular topic, we're really lucky that the duty to maintain a strata building is written into every region's legislation in some form or another. And we will try and keep it rather general when we're referring to maintenance plans, sinking funds. So Queensland, obviously, we started with the sinking fund forecast. If you're in New South Wales today, we're talking capital works fund plans. In Victoria, we've got 10-year maintenance plans. Sinking fund plans for your South Australian viewers, and we've obviously got the brand new 10-year maintenance plans for all the WA people listening today. Your Northern Territory viewers, if we've got any on, welcome, and we've got sinking fund forecasts for you guys, and also a big hello to my friends in New Zealand with our long-term maintenance plans. So regardless of where you're coming from today, we do have this version of a maintenance plan, which is essentially a future forecast for your building, and with the purpose of putting money away today for future expenses. And it was something that at some point or another, every government in each region has realised if we don't force owners to put money away today, and no one will be saving funds for future expenses for their buildings, the assets fall into disrepair, because when things fall due, instead of forking out hundreds of thousands of dollars, people choose to sell instead, and it just becomes a problem for the next owners. So we will be drilling down again on the purpose of maintenance plans, and we'll also have a few examples of where unfortunately things have gone wrong, just to show you really the importance of these maintenance plans.
So thank you, Dakota, and I'll just throw in ACT there for sinking fund plans, and hi to the nation's capital. The thing that we've done, or I've done at least over the last 15 years, is fly around a lot, visiting clients and different provinces and states and territories. And you get thinking when you're sitting in a plane for so many hours about the technology and the engineering about keeping things in the sky. And if a bus were to break down, for example, the driver pulls over, and generally the roads run parallel to a railway station, so you get a train, or they'll send another bus and pick you up and take you to the destination. But if a plane breaks down in 30,000 feet, what do? Well, what Boeing, for example, have done over the years is work out about doing preventative maintenance. And preventative maintenance is if a engineering part of a plane has 100 hours flying time before it needs to be maintained, Boeing will write into their maintenance log that it must be maintained at 80 hours. So if anything were to happen at, say, 90 hours, you've already got that covered because it's not going to get to 90 hours. So preventative maintenance is not going to happen in our industry, but what we do want is proactive maintenance. And proactive maintenance would be to have the painters, as in this clip, abseiling off the building the day after the paint is due in the sinking fund. We'll just use the term sinking fund. And that means that they're out there, they're painting the building to stop the water ingressing through the paint into the superstructure, which would then cause damage. If the paint isn't kept watertight and sealed, water will ingress through the concrete and find its nemesis, and that is steel, which is the Rio, and water and steel don't like each other, so they tend to shrink away. So as the water aggresses, the steel shrinks away and there's more rust and there's more room for more water. Concrete spalting starts, and then if this is ignored, it's called concrete cancer. And then you end up with a building that's uninhabitable, and that's what the government doesn't want. They don't want to have to go in and pick up pieces after people have let buildings fall into disrepair, and we have an example of this later on in the presentation in Sydney.
Yeah, and I think this is a good example as well. If you look at the 4 images there, it's almost like you got this brand new building, say it's straight off the factory floor, and then you go, okay, well, the next best, we should have maintained it. And we should be painting it regularly. But I'm sure there's plenty of owners listening and strata managers on a committee where they've gone, look, the paint looks fine. I can still tell that it's pink like the day we painted it, so we won't worry about painting this year. Unfortunately, not really understanding the link between the painting being a waterproofing element, not just something nice and pretty to look at. And then, as Pete said, all of a sudden we've got this concrete spalling appearing around the building. Again, no one really questioning why. And not realising it stems back to this maintenance of painting. And this is basically the scenario that unfolded enough times that each government's realised it's important to force these maintenance plans into place and not just rely on owners to do maintenance when they see fit. So we like to think of, I guess, a maintenance plan, a sinking fund, a capital works fund plan, basically as a financial tool for your scheme. So it's inevitable that these buildings will need maintenance. It's purely just a fact of life. Just like anything would, you take your car, you buy a car, you know it needs servicing, etc. So it's a tool that, if it's not utilised well, really will make or break the financial future of your scheme. And again, we've got some really good examples currently unfolding, actually, as we speak, and you've probably seen in news headlines this last week. But the financial future will be made or broken with these maintenance plans. You've got the option to either plan really well ahead of time, where you can reduce costs of the actual maintenance item because you're only engaging one trade, for instance. You've also ensuring that you're meeting your legislative duty to maintain common property. If you fall into what Peter was talking about before, where it's reactive maintenance, which is basically, I've noticed something wrong on site, let's investigate how did this come about, you end up with much higher cost to owners, and it also reflects a poor committee and if it's strata management as well in that regard. And you're going to end up with a lower yield for your investors as well, because all of a sudden they're having to pour money into a building because all these issues are arising. So again, it's one of those things that if you caught it early and it's purely just painting, great, we've just got painting trades out there. If it was left too late and you're reacting and you got concrete cancer, now we've got numerous trades involved, which we'll discuss it a bit further as well.
Yeah, and you know, this is why we found over the years as legislation's come in, starting with Queensland in '97, making it mandatory for all buildings with 2 or more lots to have a sinking fund. And it's travelled around the country. It's obviously in America and other areas. And the reason is the governments don't want to get these buildings back, and it starts with the architectural and engineering decisions. So the architect will draw some funky plan and it looks fantastic, and we go, that's attractive, we like that building, we want to live there. The engineers saddled with trying to work out how to keep that up standing. So 1/3 of the building is your superstructure and 2/3 of it is services and finishes, and they have a limited lifespan. And we tend to forget about that because we've moved in and we're enjoying the view or the location. 3 months to 2 years, you get your minor construction defects, the doors are sticking, the windows don't open properly, there might be a tap, faulty faucet, things like this. The building generally settles down. 2 years onwards, it's maintenance free. And around the 6-year mark, the short cycle items or high use items like carpet in a hallway in a tenanted building tends to wear out quicker. You get knocks on the paint, people moving in or out, and in the elevators. 6 years, your short circle. 7 years, your major maintenance costs start to kick in. It might be pumps, electric gates. 18 to 20 years, your major refurbishment costs, and then you're looking at beyond that, you got your roof. You've got some other maintenance costs that arise, and also because the building's aged and dated, you'll want to be upgrading it where possible to help compete with nearby real estate sales to keep it relevant.
Yeah.
So planning for all these items, you're left to react to issues that arise with no money to support remedial work.
Mm. And the owners listening, you know, if you're wondering why special levies are coming through so regularly, perhaps it is time to actually go back and review, have we got an adequate maintenance plan in place? Were these items that we're raising money for as emergencies foreseeable, or was this, you know, purely just something has happened like a burst pipe, etc., which I think is quite interesting to look at. And it's interesting, Pete, you're talking about how the link between the architect's design, who, you know, all these great ideas, nice colours on paper, it looks amazing, and you go and see one of these buildings and you just go, how on earth has an architect and an engineer agreed that this thing's going to stand up? And I mean, you and I were going to these buildings now going, geez, imagine the maintenance on this thing that looks amazing. Yeah. Whereas people unaware of maintenance in buildings that go, oh, geez, that looks amazing, I can't wait to take photos in front of that.
Yeah.
It's also like we're talking about the cost of reactive maintenance and underfunding on a scheme, and we've got live examples unfolding around Australia and the world at the moment. And I deal with a lot of buildings in New Zealand as well, so we see that particularly with leaky buildings at the moment. But reactive maintenance again is where something could have been prevented or done to proactively address maintenance issues of the future, but instead, for whatever reason, whether it be lack of funding or foresight in terms of no maintenance plan, we've ended up in a situation where issues have arisen and now we're left to just react to it. So you're calling in specialists, you've got defects and perhaps structural issues. Again, if you've got to this stage, you have failed a legal obligation that every strata scheme in Australia and New Zealand has, because it is written into legislation, you must maintain the building. So if you've got to the point where you've got serious issues, then there has been a breach there or a fail of that obligation. You're drawing in heaps more tradespeople. Like we were saying before, what could have just been a simple paint job is now involving structural engineers, because you've got concrete cancer, perhaps the balcony is unstable to even stand on. Do we need to look at relocating residents, etc.? Do I need council approval? Because all of a sudden now I've got to get cranes in or a boom lifts in, etc. Now I'm closing streets down. Now I've got to get a builder in to reform the concrete and redo the reinforced steel. All of this essentially was a paint job that wasn't done X amount of years ago. And this graph on the side here is a really good one. This was a survey done of just over 1,000 owners that live in Strata. And for anyone doing quick maths down the side there, yes, multiple answers were obviously allowed. But essentially they asked the owners of these items here, how many of you have noticed these in your strata scheme? And you can see nearly half of the people surveyed have at least some sort of internal water leak, which obviously then, like Pete was saying, that penetration.
That's just the thing, isn't it? Water is the building's worst friend. Yeah.
It is, and it just seems to find its way in if you're not on top of it. And cracking or internal external structures, again, most times stems from the water coming into the concrete, and then you're weakening your foundations. Again, water penetration from outside, gutter faults, all these sorts of things. If you run down that list there, are generally maintenance items that were just omitted in the past. And I've got that photo there of the fence that's collapsed, because again, it's a really great example where you've got, okay, we had a duty to maintain this fence, and clearly for whatever reason, it hasn't been done. And these maintenance items can actually turn into huge safety issues and security issues in this case as well. So it's also not just about the cost to the owners, it also becomes a hazard item in the building as well.
Yeah, if a well-maintained building is a safer one by virtue.
Yeah.
And insurance kicks in. Gee, we have full disclosure to your insurer. If a building has asbestos, the insurer needs to know. It's not up to insurer to find out, it's up to you to inform them. And if you have leaky roofs or items like that, they will eventually find out. So if there's claims getting put in because people haven't maintained something, then eventually the insurer will either not insure you, or they'll be charging a higher premium, and every claim will result in premium increase. If it's a genuine fault with a pipe in the wall or something that has burst, then that's fair enough. That's what insurance is for. Yeah, or a storm. That's what insurance is for. But a classic example I think I used is if I was driving under the influence down the road and had an accident and thought, wow, that was lucky. And I would go to my insurer and say, can you fix my car? Well, are they going to? No, they're going to say, well, that's not as per the agreement. The agreement was that you would be a law-abiding driver and comply with the road rules, not get inebriated and get behind the wheel.
Yeah.
It's the same thing eventually will happen to your building. You might get away with it a couple of times, but eventually you might have the insurer come along and say, no, we want a roof assessment, for example, before we even consider offering you a quote to insure your building.
It's funny, Pete, you're talking about getting behind the wheel, because it reminds me of a story. I was listening to a friend of mine. She was telling me over Christmas to see family, she did a drive from Brisbane all the way down to Coffs Harbour, which is a long drive, like a good 700-800 kilometres. But what she said at the start of the story was that she had a flat tyre on her car as soon as she was about to leave, and she didn't have a spare. So she ended up putting the spare from her friend's car, which was a much smaller vehicle and a much smaller tyre. And then she continued to tell me the rest of the story. And I don't remember anything for the rest of the story, because the whole time I'm just thinking, you've driven 700, 800 kilometres in a vehicle that's now void of insurance because you haven't complied. And, you know, it's such a simple thing that you don't really think about all the time. But of course, the insurers go, great, if you have an accident, well, that's get out jail free for us. We're not going to pay that one for you. Exactly.
And that's fair enough for the insurer too. They're the guys putting up the money to cover it.
You have to have a standard, yeah. So it is an interesting one. This is a hypothetical insurance scenario that we quite often pose for managers, and the managers listening today, you might have actually heard Pete and I discuss this one. But essentially, it comes down to maintenance. It covers insurance as well, and it's a situation that would be relevant to a number of buildings for any owners listening today. And we've simply posed a scenario where you fail to forecast maintenance of the lift in your scheme. Let's say there's about 100 lots and 12 floors, so pretty typical to have just one lift in operation for a building like that. Friday morning, your lift technician comes around for, let's say, his annual service or certification of the lift as is required. And he goes, guys, unfortunately, I'm going to have to shut this down because a number of parts need replacing that you haven't done to date. And the repair cost is going to be $350,000. You then ring your strata manager and go, how much we got in the bank? And they go, oh, unfortunately, only $43,000.
Underfunded.
So you've got an underfunded sinking fund balance, if it's Queensland, or maintenance plan for the rest of the states. And you're going into the weekend with 180 residents and no lift access because it's unsafe to operate. And we ran this by insurers, and the insurers basically said, well, no, we're not interested, because again, it's one of those things you fail to maintain. We have an expectation, it's the bare minimum that you maintain your scheme. And then we were talking to a number of lawyers about this scenario, and they said, look, well, we'd probably get engaged on the Monday morning as all the complaints start flying to the committee, and a strata manager going, we had to relocate for the weekend, here's my bill for the Airbnb I stayed in, blah, blah, blah. You know, you might have rentals going on, so owners are now suing for loss of rent because tenants, you know, you can't expect an elderly lady who's got a walker to be climbing 12 floors of flights of stairs to the top.
And the shopping and
shopping. I'm pretty good. I try and do one run from the car with all my bags, but there's no way I'm doing 12 floors.
And you leave your phone in the car and you have to go down 12 floors and back up again.
I'd be like, do I need it? Is it really necessary? I'll just shout. So it's one of those things that's quite realistic to happen in strata schemes if you're not careful. And this would pose a huge issue both to the strata manager if they're aware of this happening, and also the committee. And in most states, and pretty much every state, because it's written into the legislation that you must maintain your building, there's going to be those owners that see an opportunity to take legal action against the owner's corporation or the body corporate committee or the council of owners, if for the WA listeners. And therefore, obviously, then you're up for legal fees and you're trying to fight a legal battle. And another hypothetical I just thought of, it's actually not hypothetical. We had this scenario happen about 2 weeks ago, and we wrote an article about it, was a manager rang us up saying, look, we've had an unfortunate circumstance on site where someone's drilled into a wall, and it turns out that wall is probably asbestos. And so what's happened, the asbestos has blown out the other side into the common property hallway. And this asbestos then, unbeknownst to the owners, everyone was coming home from school and work, they've walked it through the entire building.
The residents were unaware of it.
They wouldn't know, they're just thinking, you know, it's plaster or something.
And wasn't this pretty much a 5 to 5 on a Friday?
It was. I was just getting ready for the weekend, thinking about what I'm going to do on the weekend. I get this call from the manager going, oh, what's the quickest you guys can come out and sample this material? And I'm going, we're well past sampling at this point. Now it's an emergency cleanup operation, because you're going into a weekend with a very hazardous substance just left in the building with, you know, numerous owners. And I actually said, you're going to need to disclose that this has happened to your insurer and see what they can do about it.
And just to streamline that, the upside was the insurers, when we spoke to them, they said no. We would have known about it. If we don't know about it, we're not going to cover it. We're not going to pay for people to be relocated, etc. Wow.
Imagine dealing with that as you go into the weekend. And it all stems back to the obligation that owners and building owners have to disclose this sort of information to insurers when there's possibly asbestos in a building.
So here we are. Is this Beirut?
No, look, you'd think so looking at this, Pete, but unfortunately it's one of the worst tragedies I've seen in strata. In reality, it's not a war zone. It's just a really poorly maintained strata building. And a fair few of the viewers today might have seen these images, and the next ones will give you
terrible, isn't it?
A really good indication of what happened, the before and after here. So this one actually was a building in Miami that's in 2018, which is about almost 4 years ago now. We're looking at, they had a survey and a structural engineering report done that recommended numerous actions to be taken, and a lot of it was really reactive maintenance by that stage because of cracks, etc., that's really threatened the structural integrity of this building. And the works due back then was $9 million worth of immediate work needed. It wasn't until sort of mid-2021 they started getting things in order. A number of owners had sold. I think the committee had changed hands. I think even the managing agent went, this is just ridiculous. I can't bear this liability. They fled. They just started getting works organised. And then it was in June, unfortunately, as they were organising contractors, that one night this building just collapsed. And unfortunately, 98 people died in this collapse. That's 98 people out of 136 units. So nearly half, you could probably say if there was 2 per unit as an average, half the people perished in this collapse. And really sad was actually, there was a phone call conversation recorded where a lady was on her balcony late at night talking to her husband who was away on a business trip. And midway through the conversation, she screamed and said, honey, the pool is collapsing. And that was moments before the actual rest of the building collapsed as well.
Dakota, this reminds me of a matter that occurred probably 7 or 8 years ago, or it might be 10 years ago now in California, where a chairperson or a president, as they're called, had done the sinking fund or reserve study, as they're called in America, on the scheme, and had sold and retired. And 7 years later, he was subpoenaed on the beach by a future owner who was suing him for not putting away enough funds to cater for the future expenses of the unit that he'd just purchased. So anyone who's involved with this building on the committee or otherwise, don't think that this is the end of the road for you guys.
Even if you manage to sell out, or you've, even years before, because what this shows is in 2018, the committee did become very much aware of these issues, and it was quite clear by the engineer that these were structural issues. And again, it was just a failure to act and foresee this happening. You can see in the before shot, it clearly wasn't a well-maintained building to begin with, but again, who would have thought it would end up in such tragedy? And look, there's a few speculative reasons that led to this collapse and the catastrophic collapse that it was. They had concrete columns, beams and walls that had weakened on the ground level. They also had an underground car park as well that unfortunately the pool sat directly over. There was evidence that the pool was leaking as well, so that went straight into concrete. There was nearby works as well. They were doing developments nearby, so they're thinking that an already weakened structure due to the structural issues and then nearby development works where the ground's being shaken could have led to this as well. So regardless, there's still a big ongoing investigation to chase liability, and it'll be really interesting for us to see what comes out of it. And certainly in the US, I've actually had a number of people discussing this. They're really concerned about buildings reaching this age that have had such a lack of maintenance. And that sort of fear has started traveling around the world to all these styles of buildings. I even talking about it in New Zealand recently, that governments are becoming increasingly concerned that buildings just of this age aren't being maintained. We all know that, we're talking defects quite recently with brand new developments, but it's this age of building that is of real concern to us because, generally the materials have aged and start to degrade by this point.
When we started doing sinking funds, to keep it simple, in British Columbia, they didn't have to fund them, but the east coast of Canada had been doing them for a number of years longer, and the law was they had to be fully funded. In 2016, I think it was the 6th of December 2016, New South Wales updated the Strata Management Act to say, we're now doing it a capital works fund, and you must have your capital works fund funded. In other words, you must have the funds there. For example, if you have $10,000 worth of capital works in the next 12 months, you must show that you have $10,000 coming in. If it's $8,000 in levies and $2,000 shortfall, well, then you need a strata loan or a special levy to bump that up. But it must be there. And this is what's going to happen. You're seeing these sort of things happening, and they're going to go, you didn't put away the funding for the future maintenance of that building. It's now mandatory. And it's a good example because we lead into another building that's been in the news lately, and how they've had to call in basically a government order to stop it ending up like this Miami building. Yeah, and I've been to this building so many times over the years. It's in Ultimo, inner city, Sydney suburb, beautiful heritage listed area. Poor maintenance has led to an NCAT ordering a management company. In this case, it was the Brighton Duggan Group, to give them full control of the strata scheme for the next 2 years to get urgent remedial works completed. Urgent works were ordered to be completed are worth $40 million. Wow. Yeah.
40 million immediately as well is the bigger thing, hey?
Yeah, so those owners are sitting there and they're investors. It's a Unilodge, it's student accommodation. Levies to owners have gone from a few thousand to at least 50. When one case was $80,000 for one owner. He had 4 units. He'd purchased them. He was 67 years of age, purchased them out of his super fund. That's $800,000, and now he's up for $80,000 per unit. And he is broke. He can't afford that because he'd spent all of his money on buying the units, thinking it was a good investment. So they can't obtain a strata loan because no one's going to touch them.
Yeah.
The banks can't sell them. So the banks going, well, no, we can't do anything about this. They've had an offer from a developer for 160 million. And this is probably the best alternative is for a developer to come in, buy the lot, everyone to cut their losses and have this building restored to a condition in which people can move back in and use it. In New South Wales, when they changed the legislation in 2016, they did a great thing, and that is to allow for, I think it was 70 or 75% vote in favour of selling to a developer. This is something that Singapore's had for quite a number of years. It takes away from having 100% vote without dissent. So in this instance, hopefully they can get that 75% vote and move on. But a lesson learned here is because the maintenance wasn't done and because the purchasers of the properties didn't do their due diligence, their strata searches, a strata search would have shown poor maintenance, and they probably would have walked away and gone, I'm not going to buy into this. So a very important lesson learned there.
And just to reiterate, Pete, because this story just blew me away, and I couldn't believe that this could even happen in our world today and in Strata, that you've got a building that's failed maintenance for so long that the government has ordered a strata management company to come in and say, get this work done because this building's going to end up collapsing in the middle of Sydney. That's $40 million. You can't get a loan because no one loans against such a poorly maintained and funded building. Obviously, a bank would be silly to do so. You've now got owners who no one can obviously afford $50,000 a year on a $200,000 purchased unit. They can't even sell these units now to get out of this scheme. So they're stuck with an asset that's draining them money. They can't even go on mortgagee sale because the bank can't sell it to anyone. No one wants to buy an individual lot in this scheme. So owners are going to end up declaring bankruptcy because they bought into this strata scheme that was just so poorly maintained. And so I hope that does sink in for a lot of owners that might be listening, that this really can be the result. We're seeing this unfold at the moment with this scheme and a few others where, you know, this lack of maintenance or this lack of understanding around budgeting maintenance can end up being a real downfall to particular owners' individual futures. And what's really important to maintain, to understand, is that the legislation in each state says that the building must be maintained regardless of anything. So in New South Wales, the Owners Corporation must maintain the building, and that is irrespective and regardless of any individual owner's financial circumstance. Regardless if they all go completely bankrupt, there is still a legal obligation that this building be maintained.
Yeah, one of the things I found, I was looking into Strata and I must have looked at 100 properties, and the first thing I'd ask the agent for is the sinking fund balance. And
they said, what's that?
Well, they generally dig it out, or they would generally have it, the proactive ones. And then I would do a quick calculation in my head and say, no, this is underfunded. And then they'd walk around the property with me and I'd point out where the building was lacking in maintenance. And in some cases, there could have been a piece of asbestos hanging off the building. I remember this. It's a beautiful small set of units on the water, and then there was uneven pavers from where there'd been flooding. It had never been rectified. I looked around the back of that. The water had pulled away all the support from the back of the pool. That hadn't been rectified. I said you have no money in the fund to fix what's already there. And he then said, well, just make an offer. And I said, no, if I bought this, I'd spend the rest of my life paying to fix it up. It's not worth anything. And this is what you've got to look at. You need to, owners, that's why it's so important with the sinking funds. What I found in Canada was that the realtors were going out and picking up the three best properties that had the best funding and maintenance done on the properties, and they're presenting that to purchasers and saying, this building has a really good sinking fund, it's fully funded, and the maintenance is up to date. So those properties were selling quicker than the ones that were underfunded. So please think of your sinking fund balance as an asset.
Come time to sell. And again, I worked as a real estate agent for a number of years, and like Pete's saying, it can be the difference between a particular interested buyer going between one unit or the other. realistically, we all live in quite urban, if not metro city areas, and one apartment to the next, they generally start to all look the same. But a savvy buyer, particularly whether it be an investor, is going to be choosing based on how much is this going to cost me to hold as an asset versus the actual return I'm going to get on this investment. So it is really important for resale and to actually maintain the value of your property. And that's this is just some of the things here, as we mentioned before, just to recap with this building where they failed. You've got a poorly maintained building. You've got now 50,000 plus in levies. Imagine seeing levies come through for $50,000 on a 1-bedroom unit in the middle of Sydney. Yeah, it's crazy. And it's an unsellable unit, like we were saying. There's no way anyone's going to buy into that, not if they know what they're doing and had a decent solicitor. A mortgagee sale is just a waste of time because no one would buy it in that regard as well. $40 million worth of immediate maintenance, which in this current climate, I've been halfway through an article actually in terms of insurance replacements, but it's also quite relevant to your actual maintenance plans as well. With everything that's happening with COVID, the costs of construction and even just getting in the materials relevant to these buildings have just blown out ridiculously. Right down to the very fact that shipping containers, which is a finite resource, believe it or not, I thought there was an infinite number of these things going around. And that's why people are making houses out of them.
Yeah, and buy them, yeah.
Yeah, but there's a finite number of shipping containers. They're sitting at ports longer purely because people that unload them are sick. And you go, okay, that makes sense. But how is that affecting the rest of the world and the construction economy? Turns out it's affecting it in a huge way because every day it sits longer at a particular port is another day that construction company hasn't got that material. Then therefore, obviously, supply is down and demand is at the same level, if not higher, because a lot of economies around the world, governments are trying to stimulate construction industry as one for employment, two, just to get money flowing. So you've got a greater demand and a reduced supply on these products. And as we know, anyone in economics, of course, then the price is going to go up. So what you thought you could replace your building for, or what you thought you could get certain works done previously to COVID is now going to be significantly more expensive in this period. And we all thought maybe, look, 1 year and we should be right. Yeah, 18 months, it must be back to normal. We're going on, what, two years at the moment. Yeah. And we still don't know if we can travel around the world or what's going on at the moment. And, you know, this isn't looking to end anytime soon in terms of the constraints to the supply chain.
No, and we've got the inflation and stuff to come yet. So inflation, just reminded me about updating sinking funds and maintenance plans. It's really important. Don't think that a maintenance plan is going to be accurate for 10 years. Because it just can't be. What Dakota's mentioned is a result of COVID. Yeah. I can tell you when the GFC hit in 2007, we had the same sort of issues. And then we had natural disasters, insurers, and at the same time, insurers are copying all of this grief. The insurers are having to pay out all this money for terrorism, natural disasters and the like. I remember 1 year I was speaking in Sydney and they were saying, why is it so expensive to get a tradesperson at the moment? And I said, well, you've got the fires in Healesville, Victoria, which were devastating, and you've got tradies going there to help get people back in a house with a roof on their head. You've got, I think it was Cyclone Larry or Yass in North Queensland. So you've got tradies going there to put tarps and roofs up to get people back inside under cover. So the natural supply and demand effect on the tradespeople is going to increase and the raw materials. So if it's gyprock, they can only work 24/7. And so therefore the price has got to go up. So whenever you have a natural disaster, any of these things like the COVIDs, the GFCs, the natural disaster, that will affect the accuracy of your sinking fund report. So it's a really good idea to get them updated every 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, I've seen something where it's, let's say it was forecasted over 15 years, which is quite standard we started that, and a number of suppliers do the same thing where you go, let's give a slightly longer look than what the legislation asked for. But within the last 15 years, you go, yeah, you had that financial crisis. So immediately you're in the back foot. What would have cost 100,000 is now already costing 200,000 and inflation's through the roof. Then you've had recently, on the other end of that same report, you've now got this COVID scenario. So if you're a scheme out there, or if you manage schemes that are just in this mindset of that's 15 years worth of reporting, let's forget about it, you're way off in terms of costs. Yeah. And it's why most legislation, I think New Zealand is fantastic, where in their legislation, it says every 3 years, this needs to be properly reviewed, this plan, because we know that construction costs are going to change. We know supplies into the country are going to change. Even labour itself, skilled labour is a difficult thing, particularly at the moment, to get tradespeople. You're telling me the other day, a painter that you know is booked out for the next 2 years worth of jobs, and he's knocking back jobs because who knows where you're going to be in 2 years.
Yeah, one of our fabricators to put up some balcony balustrades, which were in our safety report, but so it's a hazard. Can't do it. It was approved in July last year. He texted me last week and said, I'm sorry, not only can I not provide any quotes for anything else at the moment, I can't get that work done. So if you need to go elsewhere, please do. And I rang him up and I said, look, Scotty, no one else can either. And he said, since the borders have been closed, I can't get workers. I've got no one to do the work. I just can't get. So again, less people doing the work, costs rise.
So do you go to Bunnings and buy some paint rollers and
not yet,
and some paint, because that's where it's coming to. But I guess that again, the conversations around, you've got a resale value for most people. Their purchase in property is their biggest asset. If not, it's one of their biggest assets. And it's not just for you; it's a generational wealth creating asset as well. So whether you're passing it on to your kids or in the family, or it's in a family trust, this is an asset that is supposed to appreciate in value, not cost you money or send you bankrupt like we saw with that Ultimo building. And we mentioned before insurability. A well-maintained building in good condition is much easier to insure. You end up with numerous quotes to choose from come time to renew, as opposed to a building that you're lucky to get one or two insurers just to bid for it and put a quote forward. Because it's poorly maintained, it's now got safety hazards. Who knows when the thing's falling down? And building materials, if you maintain them well, they will last you longer than if you do nothing and you end up replacing them on a shorter cycle. So again, the better maintained your building is it will save you money in the long run. We'll jump through, I guess, then, Nikki, if anyone wanted to raise questions. I can see that the chat's gone nuts. Particularly, it was interesting. I think a lot of people were quite interested. As soon as we had that Uni Lodge building, I saw the chat numbers go crazy.
Definitely. That was excellent. Thank you so much. I mean, the practical examples that you've given have been really helpful. I think everyone's commented in there to say that they found them really, really helpful. So that's great. So yeah, which is wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing all of that information with us.
We didn't go too long.
No, we really get passionate, I guess. You've got the legislation and the textbook side of things, which we all know, and managers listening, you've heard this to death, but it's really important when you see these real life scenarios playing out to drill down and go, oh, it makes sense now why we have this legislation and this obligation, you know?
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me. Hopefully we'll jump into another session again in the future.
Look forward to it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. And thanks for joining us, everybody. See you next time.
See you.
Bye.